My chest tightened like someone was wringing out my heart when my son Kevin laughed at my truck in front of his colleagues, pointing at the dented fender and rust spots like I was some kind of embarrassment he had to explain away. That afternoon, standing in the parking lot of Morrison's luxury auto where Kevin worked as a senior salesman, I watched him gesture dismissively at my 1987 Ford F-150, the truck I'd driven for 38 years, the one with the cracked dashboard and the passenger door that stuck in humid weather. His co-workers gathered around, these young guys in expensive suits with their slicked back hair and their condescending smiles, and Kevin said loud enough for me to hear, "Dad still drives this dinosaur because he doesn't understand that image matters in business. He's from a generation that thinks keeping old junk is noble instead of just sad." The laughter that followed felt like needles in my skin, sharp and painful and impossible to ignore, and I stood there with my keys in my hand, feeling smaller than I had since I was a boy being picked on in the schoolyard for wearing hand-me-down clothes. The worst part wasn't the mockery itself, though that stung plenty. It was the casual cruelty of it. The way Kevin didn't even glance over to see if I'd heard, didn't care that his 70-year-old father was standing right there absorbing every word of his contempt. I'd driven to the dealership to surprise him, to take him to lunch like we used to do when he first started in car sales 15 years ago, back when he still seemed to respect me, still asked for my advice, instead of treating me like a relic from a simpler, stupider time. But watching him perform for his audience, using me as the punchline to establish his superiority, I realized something had shifted in our relationship, something fundamental and maybe irreparable, and the grief of that realization mixed with my anger until I couldn't tell which emotion was stronger. I got back in my truck without saying a word, without interrupting his show, and I drove home with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white and my arthritis flared up like it does when I'm stressed or upset. The engine made that familiar rattling sound it's made since the late 90s, a sound I'd learned to ignore, the same way you ignore the ticking of a clock or the hum of a refrigerator. And I thought about all the miles this truck and I had traveled together, all the memories embedded in its dented metal and worn upholstery. This wasn't just transportation. It was a time capsule, a rolling history of my life, and Kevin's mockery felt like mockery of everything I'd built and been and valued over 7 decades of living. But he had no idea, none of them did, about the hidden family secrets I'd kept for 35 years, about the silent investments I'd made, while everyone assumed I was just a simple mechanic who fixed cars instead of understanding the business side of the automotive industry. Family betrayal comes in many forms, and sometimes it's not about stealing money or spreading lies. Sometimes it's just about disrespecting the person who gave you everything, who sacrificed so you could have opportunities they never had, who stayed quiet about their own achievements so you could feel like the successful one, the one who made it, the one who mattered. The story of how I came to own Morrison's luxury auto, the very dealership where my son mocked me that afternoon, starts 40 years ago when I was 30 and working as a mechanic in a small garage on the east side of town. Those were lean years, with my wife Linda and baby Kevin in a 2-bedroom apartment that smelled like mildew no matter how much we cleaned, with bills piling up faster than I could pay them on my modest salary, with dreams that seemed impossible given our circumstances. I was good with cars, though, always had been since I was a teenager, taking apart my father's old Chevrolet and putting it back together just to understand how everything fit, and customers started requesting me specifically because I could diagnose problems other mechanics missed, could fix things efficiently and honestly without the usual upselling and gouging that gave the industry a bad name. One of my regular customers was an older gentleman named Harold Morrison, must have been in his 60s back then, and he owned the Morrison dealership that was already established as the premier luxury car seller in our city. Harold would bring his personal vehicles to me instead of his own service department, said he trusted my work more than the young guys he employed, and we'd talk while I changed his oil or replaced his brake pads, conversations about life and business and the automotive industry's future. He had no children, no heirs to take over his dealership when he retired, and he worried constantly about what would happen to the business he'd built from nothing over 40 years, whether it would be sold to some corporate chain that would strip it for parts and destroy his legacy. Harold started teaching me about the business side of the industry, lending me books about dealership operations and profit margins and inventory management, inviting me to lunch where he'd explain the complexities of manufacturer relationships and financing arrangements and customer service protocols. At first I thought he was just being kind, mentoring a young mechanic who showed interest. But gradually, I understood he was evaluating me, testing whether I had the intelligence and integrity to eventually take over his dealership when the time came. The idea seemed absurd, me running a luxury auto dealership when I could barely afford to fix the leak in our apartment ceiling. But Harold saw something in me I didn't see in myself, some potential that was invisible to everyone, including me. When Kevin was 5 years old and Linda was pregnant with our daughter Sarah, Harold made me an offer that changed everything. He said he wanted to sell me 49% of the dealership for $1, structuring it so I'd gradually increase my ownership over the next 20 years until I owned the whole thing outright, with him staying on as a consultant and mentor until he felt confident I could run it independently. The only conditions were that I had to keep working as a mechanic for at least 10 more years to truly understand the service side of the business from the ground up, and I had to keep the ownership structure completely confidential, telling no one, including my family, because he didn't want employees or competitors getting spooked by rumors of a succession plan. I asked him why me, why a 30-year-old grease monkey with no business degree or management experience. And Harold looked at me with these watery blue eyes that had seen decades of life and said, "Because you're honest, Samuel. And in this industry, honesty is rarer than diamonds, rarer than integrity or intelligence or any other quality people claim to value." He said he'd watched me turn down opportunities to overcharge customers, watched me recommend cheaper solutions when expensive ones would have profited me more, watched me treat people with respect regardless of whether they drove a Bentley or a beat-up Honda, and that character was worth more than any MBA or family connection. So I signed the papers, became a minority owner in Morrison's luxury auto, while continuing to work as a mechanic in a different garage entirely, keeping the secret like Harold requested, because I understood his reasoning and because honestly, I was terrified people would think I was putting on airs, pretending to be something I wasn't. Linda never knew, thought I was just a dedicated mechanic who worked long hours to provide for our growing family, and I let her believe that because it was easier than explaining a situation I barely understood myself. Over the next 2 decades, I gradually increased my ownership stake through a complex arrangement where dealership profits were funneled into purchasing additional shares, all structured by Harold's lawyers to be completely legal and above board, until by the time I turned 50, I owned 75% of Morrison's, while Harold retained 25% and active involvement in major decisions. Harold died when I was 58, 12 years ago now, and his will transferred his remaining shares to me, along with a letter thanking me for honoring our agreement and exceeding his expectations for growing the dealership's revenue by 300% over those years through innovations in service quality and customer satisfaction that I'd implemented quietly from behind the scenes. I attended his funeral as just another employee paying respects, not as the owner I secretly was, and I cried genuine tears for a man who'd believed in me when nobody else did, who'd given me opportunities I never could have earned through conventional paths, who taught me that success isn't about flash and status symbols. It's about competence and character, and playing the long game while everyone else chases immediate gratification. But I still didn't tell my family, still kept working as a mechanic until I retired at 65, still drove my old Ford truck and lived in our modest house, and maintained the appearance of being a simple working-class man who'd never achieved anything remarkable. Part of it was Harold's influence, his belief that true wealth whispers while poverty shouts, and part of it was my own personality, never comfortable with attention or recognition, always happier in the background, fixing problems, than in the spotlight, taking credit. But mostly, and I'm ashamed to admit this now, mostly it was a test, a way of seeing how my children would treat me when they thought I had nothing to offer them except love and wisdom, and the example of a life lived with integrity. Kevin failed that test, failed it so completely and publicly that I could no longer ignore what he'd become, what maybe I'd enabled him to become, by never showing him that success could look like quiet dignity instead of loud achievement. Sarah was different. My daughter, who became a teacher and never mocked my truck or my life choices, who called every week just to talk and visited regularly without needing a reason beyond wanting to spend time with me. But Kevin had gone a different direction, chasing money and status and image with an intensity that scared me sometimes, that made me wonder where I'd gone wrong in raising him. The real tragedy, the thing that kept me up nights after that parking lot humiliation, was that Kevin actually worked at the dealership I owned, had been selling cars there for 15 years without knowing his father was his ultimate boss, was the reason he'd been hired in the first place, because I'd quietly told the general manager to give my son an opportunity when he was struggling to break into the industry. Kevin thought he'd earned his position through his own merit, through his aggressive sales tactics and his ability to close deals with wealthy clients. And maybe he had earned it in a way. I'd certainly never interfered with his performance reviews or commissions, but the foundation of his opportunity was my hidden ownership, my silent investment in his success, even as he grew more contemptuous of my apparent failure. But that was only the beginning of understanding just how deep the disrespect went, how little my son valued the man who raised him. The weeks after that parking lot incident were quiet on the surface, with me going about my normal routine of retirement, tending my garden and reading my books, and having coffee with other retirees at the diner on Wednesday mornings. But underneath, I was processing anger and disappointment and a growing determination to teach Kevin a lesson he'd remember for the rest of his life. I thought about Harold's wisdom, his belief that elder respect isn't automatic, it's earned through actions that demonstrate your value, and I realized I'd been doing it backwards, hiding my value to test people's character, when maybe the better approach was showing them what they'd overlooked, what they'd dismissed because it didn't fit their narrow definition of success. Linda had been gone 5 years by then, cancer taking her the same way it takes too many good people, and I missed her perspective on this situation, missed her ability to see nuance where I only saw right and wrong. She'd always defended Kevin, made excuses for his behavior, said he was just ambitious and driven and didn't mean to be hurtful. And maybe she was right. Maybe I was being too harsh, too willing to see betrayal where there was just thoughtlessness. But then something happened that eliminated any doubt about whether intervention was needed, that showed me Kevin's contempt wasn't just casual mockery, but something deeper and more concerning. Sarah called me on a Thursday evening, her voice tight with anger and hurt, and she told me about a conversation she'd overheard at a family gathering I hadn't attended, some birthday party for Kevin's oldest son, where apparently alcohol had loosened tongues and revealed truths people usually kept hidden. Kevin had been talking with his wife Jennifer and some of their friends, complaining about having to eventually deal with me when I got too old to live independently, joking about how he'd have to find the cheapest nursing home possible because it wasn't like I had any assets worth protecting. It wasn't like I'd be leaving behind any inheritance that would justify spending money on quality care. Jennifer had laughed, added something about how at least my old house might be worth something if they tore it down and sold the land, and everyone had agreed that dealing with aging parents was just one of those burdens you had to accept when they'd failed to plan properly for their retirement. Sarah had confronted them right there, told them they were being cruel and disrespectful, reminded them that I'd worked hard my whole life to provide for our family and deserved better than being discussed like I was a financial problem waiting to happen. Kevin had brushed her off, said she was being too sensitive, that they were just being realistic about elder care costs and planning ahead, and Sarah had left the party in tears, driven straight home, and called me to apologize for her brother's behavior, even though she had nothing to apologize for. Listening to my daughter cry on the phone because of my son's cruelty, that was the moment I decided to stop hiding, stop testing, stop waiting for Kevin to somehow develop the character and compassion he should have learned decades ago. I thanked Sarah for telling me, assured her I wasn't upset with her, And then I spent the rest of that evening sitting in my workshop, the converted garage, where I still tinkered with small engine repairs as a hobby, thinking about how to handle this situation in a way that would be educational rather than just vindictive, that would highlight the lesson rather than just the punishment. The answer came to me around midnight, sitting there surrounded by tools I'd collected over 50 years of working with my hands, looking at the old coffee can, where I kept spare change and odd screws and random bits of hardware. I would attend the next dealership management meeting, something I'd never done despite being the owner, something I'd always handled through proxy by communicating my wishes to the general manager, who then presented them as his own ideas. I would reveal myself, my ownership, my silent role in building the business Kevin was so proud of working for, and I would do it in a way that forced him to confront every assumption he'd made about me, every dismissive comment, every moment of disrespect that he thought was justified because his father was just a failed mechanic who couldn't afford a new truck. But I had to be careful, had to do this right, because the goal wasn't just to humiliate Kevin the way he'd humiliated me. It was to teach him something valuable about judging people by appearances, about respecting your elders even when you don't understand their choices, about the danger of assumptions and arrogance and mistaking visibility for substance. So I called the general manager, Carl Henderson, a man I'd worked closely with for 20 years and who knew my identity and my management philosophy, and I told him it was time for me to step into a more visible role, that I wanted to attend next month's leadership meeting and introduce myself to the management team as the owner they'd never met. Carl was surprised, asked if I was sure, reminded me that I'd always preferred anonymity and had structured everything to maintain that privacy. But I explained the situation with Kevin, and Carl understood immediately, said he'd been concerned about my son's attitude for a while, his tendency to talk down to support staff and treat customers like marks instead of people, his general lack of the values that made our dealership successful. Carl said he'd actually been considering whether to promote Kevin to a management position, something Kevin had been aggressively lobbying for, but had hesitated because of concerns about his character and judgment, and maybe this meeting would resolve that question one way or another. The month leading up to that meeting was strange, knowing I was about to fundamentally change my relationship with my son and possibly damage it beyond repair, wondering if I was being wise or just vindictive, questioning whether Linda would approve or tell me I was being unnecessarily harsh. I visited her grave several times, stood there talking to a headstone the way old men do when loneliness gets too heavy to carry alone, and I told her about the parking lot, about Sarah's phone call, about my plan to reveal myself at the management meeting. I don't know if I expected an answer, some sign from the universe about what she'd want me to do, but all I got was silence and the sound of wind through the cemetery trees, and the knowledge that this decision was mine alone to make. Sarah invited me to dinner during that waiting period, cooked my favorite pot roast the way Linda used to make it, and afterward we sat on her back porch drinking coffee and watching her kids play in the yard, and she asked me what I was going to do about Kevin. I told her the truth, explained about Morrison's, about Harold's mentorship, about the 35 years of secret ownership and silent management, and she laughed, actually laughed out loud, and said she couldn't believe I'd kept something that big secret for that long, that it was the most elaborate patient revenge setup she'd ever heard of. But then she got serious, asked me if I was sure this was how I wanted Kevin to find out, if maybe I should just tell him privately instead of embarrassing him professionally, and I explained that the point was precisely that Kevin needed to understand how his behavior affected not just family relationships, but professional reputation, how disrespecting people has consequences beyond hurt feelings. Sarah nodded, said she understood, but that she worried Kevin would be so humiliated he'd never forgive me, never be able to rebuild our relationship, and was I prepared for that possibility? I told her honestly that I didn't know, that maybe some relationships can't survive certain truths, but that living with Kevin's contempt while he remained ignorant of his own foolishness wasn't sustainable either, that something had to change, even if that change was painful. She hugged me, told me she'd support whatever I decided, and then she said something that stuck with me. She said, "Dad, You've spent your whole life being underestimated because you chose dignity over flash. And maybe it's time people saw what quiet dignity actually built. Maybe that's not showing off. Maybe that's just setting the record straight. The morning of the management meeting arrived cold and gray, one of those October days where you can feel winter coming in the bite of the wind and the smell of dead leaves. And I dressed carefully in my best suit, the one I'd bought for Linda's funeral and hadn't worn since. And I drove my dented Ford truck to Morrison's luxury auto for the first time since that parking lot humiliation. The irony wasn't lost on me. Pulling into the employee parking area in my rusty 38-year-old pickup, while surrounded by this year's Mercedes and BMWs and Audis, knowing that I owned the land under their tires, owned the building they worked in, owned the entire business they were so proud to be part of. I sat in my truck for a few minutes, hands on the steering wheel, breathing slowly to calm my nerves, because despite everything, I'm not a confrontational person by nature, not someone who enjoys conflict or dramatic reveals, and part of me wanted to just drive away, maintain the secret, avoid the inevitable pain this was going to cause. But I got out of the truck, locked the door with that familiar squeaky sound the lock made, and I walked toward the dealership's main entrance with my shoulders back and my head up, carrying myself with a confidence I'd earned over 70 years, even if nobody recognized it. The receptionist greeted me warmly, knew me as Carl's guest for the meeting, and she directed me to the conference room on the second floor where the management team was gathering. I took the stairs instead of the elevator because stairs keep you young and elevators make you lazy. That's what my father used to say, and I needed those extra minutes to prepare myself for what was coming. The conference room was exactly what you'd expect at a luxury dealership: expensive tables surrounded by leather chairs, walls decorated with photos of high-end vehicles, and awards the dealership had won, windows overlooking the showroom floor where salespeople were already working the morning customers. The management team was filing in, about 15 people total, sales managers and service directors and finance department heads, all of them younger than me, all of them dressed in designer suits and radiating that particular confidence that comes from working in a successful business. And there was Kevin, my son, sitting near the head of the table, joking with colleagues, completely unaware that his father was about to walk through that door and change everything he thought he knew about power and success and family dynamics. Carl saw me first, stood up and announced to the room that they had a special guest this morning, someone they'd all heard about but never met, and he introduced me as Samuel Peters, the owner of Morrison's luxury auto, the silent investor who'd been guiding the dealership's strategy and growth for over 3 decades. The room went quiet, confused, because most of them knew Harold Morrison as the founder and probably assumed some corporation or investment group had bought it after his death, and they certainly didn't expect a 70-year-old man in an off-the-rack suit who drove a truck older than most of their careers. Kevin's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion first, then disbelief, then a dawning horror as he realized what this meant, who I was, what he'd said about me to colleagues, some of whom were sitting in this very room. I watched him process it, watched his skin go pale and then flush red, watched his hands grip the armrests of his chair like he needed something solid to hold on to while his world rearranged itself, and I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness because this was necessary, but that didn't make it pleasant. I addressed the room calmly, explained my history with Harold Morrison, how he'd mentored me and structured the ownership transition, how I'd preferred to remain anonymous while learning the business from every angle, how Carl had been my partner in management, even though he got public credit for decisions I'd helped make. I talked about my philosophy of business, that success isn't about maximizing profit at the expense of relationships, that treating employees and customers with respect creates sustainable growth more effectively than aggressive tactics, that our dealership's reputation was built on integrity and service quality, values I'd learned as a mechanic and carried into ownership. The management team listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about my vision and plans, clearly trying to figure out what this revelation meant for their positions and futures, and I assured them that nothing would change operationally I was simply stepping into a more visible role while maintaining the same principles that had guided us for decades. Then I addressed Kevin directly, acknowledged him as my son to the shocked faces around the table, and I said I wanted to talk about the parking lot incident from a month ago, about how he'd mocked my truck and my choices in front of his colleagues, and how that interaction had revealed a fundamental misunderstanding about what actually matters in life and business. Kevin tried to interrupt, started to apologize or explain, but I held up my hand and continued, saying this wasn't about humiliating him, it was about teaching a lesson that apparently hadn't been learned through subtler methods. I explained that my truck, the one he found so embarrassing, was a symbol of my values, a reminder that possessions don't define worth, that maintaining something well and using it fully is more honorable than constantly chasing the newest model. I explained that I'd kept my ownership secret partly for strategic business reasons, but partly as a test, wanting to see how my children would treat me when they thought I had nothing to offer them except love and guidance. And Kevin had failed that test spectacularly. I told him about Sarah's phone call, about overhearing his conversation about finding the cheapest nursing home for me, about his assumption that I'd failed to plan for retirement and would be a burden rather than someone who'd actually built something substantial. The room was silent, uncomfortable, with people avoiding eye contact and shifting in their seats, but I kept going because this needed to be said, needed to be witnessed, needed to be part of the record so Kevin couldn't later pretend it hadn't happened or minimize its significance. I said that family betrayal comes in many forms, and one of the most insidious is contempt disguised as concern. The assumption that because someone's life looks different from yours, smaller or simpler, or less impressive by conventional standards, they must be less capable, less successful, less worthy of respect. I looked directly at my son and said, "You work here, in this dealership, selling these cars, drawing this salary, building this career, and you never once questioned why you were hired, why you were given opportunities, why you've been successful. You assumed it was all your own merit, your own talent, your own impressive personality, and maybe part of it was. But the foundation was my investment in you, my silent support, my belief that despite your flaws, you deserved a chance to prove yourself. And this is how you repay that investment, by mocking the man who made it possible, by treating him like an embarrassment, by planning his elder care like he's a problem to be solved cheaply." Kevin was crying by then, quiet tears running down his face, while his colleagues pretended not to notice, and I felt my anger softening into something more complicated, something like grief for the relationship we'd lost, and the lessons he should have learned organically, but had to learn through pain instead. I told him I wasn't firing him, wasn't going to sabotage his career, or punish him professionally, but that our relationship was going to change, that he needed to decide whether he wanted to be my son, with all the respect and reciprocity that entails, or just an employee who happened to share my last name. Carl stepped in then, probably sensing I was reaching my emotional limit, and he steered the conversation toward practical matters, discussing quarterly numbers and strategic initiatives and upcoming inventory decisions, and the meeting continued with a strained normalcy that everyone was grateful for. Kevin didn't contribute, just sat there staring at the table, and when the meeting ended he was the first one out the door, rushing away before I could talk to him further, before anyone could ask him questions or offer sympathy, or whatever people do in these unbearably awkward situations. I stayed behind with Carl, and we sat in that empty conference room surrounded by expensive furniture and automotive awards, and he asked me if I felt better, if the revelation had accomplished what I'd hoped. I told him honestly that I didn't know, that I felt relieved to finally stop hiding, but also sad about the way it had happened, about the fact that this confrontation had been necessary at all. Carl said he understood, that he'd dealt with his own family complications over the years, that sometimes the people closest to us are the hardest to teach because they think familiarity means they already know everything about us, when really, familiarity just means they've stopped looking closely enough to see who we actually are. Little did I know that the real reckoning was just beginning, that Kevin's response would force both of us to confront truths we'd been avoiding for years. The days immediately after the management meeting were silent. No calls from Kevin, no text messages, no attempts to explain or apologize or even argue about what had happened. I respected his need for space, understood he was processing shame and shock and probably anger at me for handling it so publicly. But I also worried about him, wondered if he was okay, if his marriage was surviving the stress, if his job performance was suffering. Sarah provided updates, said Kevin had called her several times, said he was devastated and humiliated and didn't know how to face me or his colleagues, said Jennifer was being supportive but also frustrated because Kevin's pride had put them in this awkward situation. The silence broke 2 weeks later when Kevin showed up at my house on a Saturday morning, arriving in his sleek BMW that he'd always been so proud of, parking next to my dented Ford in the driveway, like a visual representation of everything that had divided us. He looked terrible, exhausted and thinner than I remembered, with circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. And when I opened the door, he just stood there for a long moment before asking if we could talk. I invited him in, offered coffee like I always did, and we sat in my kitchen at the same table where I'd eaten meals with Linda and raised our children and navigated countless family discussions over decades of marriage and parenthood. Kevin started by apologizing, a genuine apology without excuses or justifications, saying he'd been a terrible son, that he'd taken me for granted and judged me unfairly, and let his own insecurities about money and status poison his ability to appreciate what he had. He said the parking lot mockery haunted him now, that he replayed it in his head constantly and cringed at his own cruelty, that he couldn't believe he'd treated his father that way just to impress colleagues who didn't even matter in the long run. He said the conversation Sarah overheard about nursing homes was even worse, that he'd been drinking and saying things to sound pragmatic and adult when really he was just being callous and mercenary, reducing his father's future to a financial problem instead of recognizing it as an opportunity to return the care he'd received as a child. I listened to all of this, sipping my coffee and watching his face, trying to gauge whether this was genuine growth or just performance, whether he was sorry for his actions or just sorry he'd been caught and exposed. I think it was genuine, or at least I wanted to believe it was, because the alternative was too sad to contemplate. The possibility that my son was beyond redemption, that the values Linda and I tried to instill had failed completely. So I accepted his apology, told him I understood that people make mistakes, that pride and insecurity can twist good people into doing hurtful things, that what matters is learning from those mistakes instead of repeating them. But I also told him that apologies aren't enough, that real change requires action, requires demonstrating through choices and behavior that you've actually learned something instead of just saying what people want to hear. I told him I expected him to treat all people with respect going forward, regardless of their job title or income level or social status, that I'd be watching how he interacted with dealership support staff and service technicians and customers, that his character would be judged by how he treated people who couldn't offer him anything in return. I told him I expected him to be present for family occasions, to build relationships with his sister and his children that were based on genuine connection instead of obligation, to be the kind of son and brother and father that would make Linda proud if she could see him. Kevin nodded, said he would do better, said he wanted to rebuild our relationship if I'd give him the chance, and I told him I would, but that trust is like a cracked windshield. Once broken, it's never quite the same even after repair. There's always a visible reminder of the damage. He said he understood, said he'd earn back my trust, however long it took, and then he asked a question that surprised me. He asked if I would teach him about the business, really teach him, share the knowledge Harold Morrison had shared with me, help him understand what actually made the dealership successful beyond just sales tactics and commission structures. That request, more than the apologies or the tears or the promises to do better, convinced me Kevin was serious about change, because he was asking to learn, asking to be mentored, asking to see me as a source of wisdom instead of an embarrassment to be managed. I agreed, told him we could start with weekly meetings where I'd explain dealership operations and business philosophy, where we'd talk about Harold's principles and my experiences, and the lessons I'd learned over 40 years of silent ownership. I told him this would be a long process, that understanding business isn't about memorizing strategies. It's about developing judgment and character, about learning to balance profit with principle and ambition with integrity. Those weekly meetings became the foundation of rebuilding our relationship, sessions where we'd sit in my workshop with coffee and notebooks, where I'd share stories about Harold and early challenges and decisions that had shaped the dealership's culture. Kevin was a better student than I expected, asking thoughtful questions and taking notes and actually listening instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. And gradually, I saw glimpses of the boy I'd raised, the curious kid who used to help me fix things in the garage before ambition and insecurity had warped him into someone I barely recognized. We talked about the truck during one of those sessions, about why I still drove it, and I explained that it represented more than frugality or stubbornness. It was a reminder of where I came from, a connection to the years when Linda was alive, and our kids were young and we didn't have much money, but we had each other and that was enough. I explained that every dent and rust spot had a story, memories embedded in metal, and replacing the truck would feel like abandoning those memories, like declaring that my past didn't matter because it wasn't impressive enough by current standards. Kevin listened and said he understood now, said he'd been so focused on image and perception that he'd forgotten objects can have emotional value that exceeds their monetary worth, that his father's beat-up truck was actually a shrine to a life well lived, rather than evidence of failure to achieve. But understanding wasn't the same as acceptance, and there were still tensions in our relationship, still moments where Kevin's old patterns emerged, and I had to decide whether to confront him or let it slide. One incident stands out, about 3 months into our rebuilding process, when I visited the dealership and overheard Kevin being dismissive with one of the service technicians, using that condescending tone people use when they think they're superior to the person they're talking to. I pulled him aside afterward and reminded him about respect, about how the service department was the backbone of our business, about how technicians like that man were doing the same work I'd done for decades and deserved to be treated with dignity. Kevin got defensive initially, said he was just being efficient and direct, that I was being too sensitive, but I didn't back down, told him this was exactly the test I'd mentioned, that his character was revealed not in how he treated customers or management, but in how he treated people who had no power over his career. He apologized to the technician the next day, a genuine apology that I heard about later from Carl, and I felt proud of him for that, proud that he was choosing to grow instead of doubling down on his flaws. Sarah was instrumental during this rebuilding period, serving as a bridge between Kevin and me, offering perspective and encouragement and occasional tough love when one of us was being stubborn. She'd have us both over for dinner, create opportunities for casual interaction outside the formal business mentoring, remind us of shared memories and family traditions that connected us despite recent pain. Her children, my grandchildren, helped too, their innocent affection for their grandpa, forcing Kevin to see me through their eyes as someone valuable and interesting rather than just the old man who'd embarrassed him professionally. Jennifer, Kevin's wife, was harder to read, maintaining a polite distance that suggested she was reserving judgment, waiting to see if the changes in her husband were permanent or just temporary performance. I understood her skepticism, had probably destroyed her image of me as the bumbling father-in-law when I revealed the dealership ownership, and she needed time to adjust to this new reality where her husband's father wasn't who she thought he was. But gradually she warmed up, started asking me about business decisions and career advice, seemed genuinely interested in learning from someone who'd achieved success without the usual markers of achievement, and I appreciated her willingness to reassess her assumptions. The real breakthrough came 6 months after the management meeting, during a family gathering at my house for what would have been Linda's birthday. We were all there, Sarah and her family, Kevin and Jennifer and their kids, sitting around my old dining room table, eating the pot roast recipe Linda had perfected over decades. And Kevin stood up unexpectedly and asked if he could say something. He talked about his mother, about how much he missed her, about how he wished he could tell her he was sorry for not being the son she deserved, for getting so lost in ambition and status that he'd forgotten the values she tried to teach him. Then he turned to me, his voice cracking with emotion, and he said that Linda would have been disappointed in how he'd treated me, that she'd raised him better than that his behavior over the past few years had been an insult to her memory as much as to me. He said that finding out about the dealership ownership had been the most humiliating moment of his life, but also the most important, that it had forced him to confront his own arrogance and cruelty, that he was grateful for it even though it hurt. He said he wanted to be a better man, the kind of man who judged people by their character rather than their possessions, who treated everyone with respect regardless of their perceived status, who understood that real success was measured in relationships and integrity rather than money and image. The whole table was crying by the end of that speech, even the grandchildren who didn't fully understand what was happening, but picked up on the emotional weight of the moment. And I got up and hugged my son for the first time in months. Really hugged him, and I told him I loved him and was proud of him for having the courage to change, to admit mistakes, to do the hard work of becoming better. Sarah hugged us both, and Jennifer wiped her eyes, and the grandchildren joined in creating this big family pile that felt healing in a way I hadn't experienced since Linda died. That was the turning point, the moment when I knew our relationship would survive, that the lesson had been learned, that the painful revelation in the management meeting had been worth it despite the immediate cost. But there was still work to do, still patterns to break and new habits to build, still moments of backsliding that required patience and correction and faith that change was possible. Over the following year, Kevin's transformation became more visible, more consistent, more clearly embedded in his character rather than just his behavior. Colleagues at the dealership commented on it, said he was easier to work with, more respectful, less aggressive in his sales tactics, more focused on customer satisfaction than commission maximization. Carl promoted him to sales manager, a position Kevin had wanted for years, but with the explicit understanding that he was expected to mentor younger salespeople in the principles of ethical selling and customer respect, to model the values that made our dealership successful rather than just chasing numbers. Kevin took that responsibility seriously, conducted training sessions on treating customers with dignity, taught his team to listen more and talk less, emphasized that repeat business and referrals were worth more than one-time sales to customers you pressure into deals they'll regret. I attended one of his training sessions unannounced, sat in the back of the room watching him teach, and I recognized Harold Morrison's principles in his words, the same lessons about integrity and service quality and long-term relationship building that Harold had taught me 40 years ago. The cycle was continuing, the mentorship tradition being passed to another generation, and I felt Linda's presence in that moment, her approval and pride in our son's growth. The truck became a teaching tool in those sessions, with Kevin using his own mockery of it as an example of how easily we judge people by superficial markers, how his father's dented Ford had represented wisdom and values and quiet success that he'd been too blind to see. He told his sales team about finding out I owned the dealership, about the shame and revelation and transformation that followed, and he encouraged them to look beyond obvious signals of wealth when evaluating customers and colleagues, to remember that the most substantial people are often the quietest, the most successful businesses are often the most humble. I started attending management meetings regularly after that initial revelation, no longer hiding my ownership, but not dominating discussions either, serving as a resource and a guide while letting Carl and the other managers run day-to-day operations. My role was strategic rather than tactical, offering perspective from my decades of experience, asking questions that made people think about long-term consequences, reminding everyone that our success was built on relationships and reputation rather than just profit margins. Kevin participated in those meetings now as a manager, and I watched him contribute thoughtfully, challenge assumptions respectfully, support his team members instead of competing with them, and I felt that mixture of relief and pride that comes from seeing your children finally embody the values you try to teach them. The business thrived under this approach, with customer satisfaction scores increasing, employee retention improving, and revenue growing steadily without the aggressive tactics our competitors used. We became known in the industry as the dealership that treated people right, the place where salespeople actually listened to customer needs instead of pushing the most expensive options, where service technicians were respected as skilled professionals rather than treated as necessary inconveniences. Other dealerships started copying our approach, attending our training sessions, asking Carl about our management philosophy, and I'd sit in those conversations knowing that Harold Morrison's legacy was spreading beyond our single location, influencing the broader industry in small but meaningful ways. But the story wasn't over, wasn't neatly resolved into happily ever after, because life doesn't work that way, and people are more complicated than simple redemption narratives suggest. Kevin still struggled sometimes with his old patterns, with the need to impress people, improve himself, and measure his worth by external validation. And I had to remind him occasionally about what actually matters, about why we do this work, about the difference between success that lasts and success that fades as soon as the next person comes along with a better offer. One incident particularly tested our rebuilt relationship about 18 months after the management meeting, when Kevin came to me with a proposal to expand the dealership, to open a second location that would double our market reach and potentially triple our revenue over 5 years. He'd done detailed market research, created impressive financial projections, developed partnerships with manufacturers and finance companies, put together a comprehensive business plan that was clearly the product of serious work and strategic thinking. He was excited about it, convinced this was the next logical step in our growth, the opportunity to take what we'd built and scale it up to something even more impressive. I listened to his presentation, reviewed his documents, asked questions about risks and capital requirements and management capacity, and then I told him no, we weren't going to expand, weren't going to open a second location, weren't going to pursue growth for growth's sake. Kevin was shocked, confused, asked me why I was rejecting what seemed like an obvious opportunity, and I explained that bigger isn't always better, that scaling up requires sacrificing some of the personal attention and relationship focus that made us successful, that I'd rather have one excellent dealership than 2 mediocre ones. He argued with me, got frustrated and angry, said I was being stubborn and risk-averse, said I was holding him back from achieving his potential, said this was exactly the kind of outdated thinking that made me drive a 39-year-old truck instead of enjoying the wealth I'd accumulated. And I let him vent, let him express his frustration, and then I told him a story about Harold Morrison. I told him that Harold had faced the same decision 30 years ago, had been pressured by partners and consultants to expand, to franchise the Morrison name and open locations across the state, to build an empire rather than just a single successful business. Harold had refused, had said that his reputation was worth more than market share, that he could only maintain quality control and customer relationships at a scale where he knew everyone's name, where he could personally ensure every transaction reflected his values. Harold had watched other dealerships expand rapidly and then collapse under the weight of their own complexity, had seen reputations destroyed by franchise locations that cut corners and mistreated customers, had learned that sustainable success was about depth rather than breadth. I told Kevin that I'd adopted Harold's philosophy, that the dealership was successful precisely because we stayed small enough to maintain standards, because every employee knew they were part of something meaningful rather than just cogs in a corporate machine, because our customers recommended us based on personal experience rather than advertising budgets. I told him that his expansion plan was impressive from a business perspective, but wrong from a values perspective, that we'd lose what made us special in the pursuit of becoming bigger, that he was confusing growth with achievement and scale with success. Kevin didn't like that answer, left my house frustrated and disappointed, and we didn't speak for 2 weeks while he processed his emotions, and I wondered if I'd been too harsh, if I should have just let him try his expansion plan and learned from the consequences. But Sarah reminded me that saying no was also a form of respect, that I was treating Kevin like an adult by being honest about my reasoning rather than just rubber-stamping his ideas, that disagreement doesn't equal rejection. When Kevin finally came back, he said he understood, said he'd been thinking about Harold's philosophy and my concerns, said he realized he'd been chasing growth for ego reasons rather than sound business reasons, that he wanted to impress people by building something big rather than maintaining something excellent. He said he'd been falling back into his old patterns of measuring worth by visible achievement, forgetting the lessons about quiet dignity and sustainable success, and he appreciated that I'd stopped him before he made a mistake that could have damaged everything we'd built. That conversation, that moment of Kevin accepting my decision and understanding my reasoning, was when I knew he'd truly changed, truly internalized the values I'd been trying to teach. Because it's easy to accept mentorship when it tells you what you want to hear, when it supports your ambitions and validates your instincts. But real growth comes from accepting guidance that contradicts your impulses, that prioritizes long-term values over short-term opportunities, that requires you to trust someone else's wisdom, even when you don't fully understand it yet. The years that followed were quieter, more stable, characterized by steady improvement rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Kevin became an excellent sales manager, developing a reputation in the industry for ethical leadership and customer focus, mentoring young salespeople who then spread those values to other dealerships when they moved on to other opportunities. Sarah continued teaching, raising her children with the same emphasis on character and integrity that Linda and I had tried to instill in our own kids, creating another generation that hopefully wouldn't need painful lessons about respect and assumptions. My grandchildren got older, started asking me about my life, and I told them stories about their grandmother, about Harold Morrison, about working as a mechanic and secretly owning a dealership and driving a beat-up truck that represented more than they could see on the surface. I taught them about patience and persistence, about judging people by their character rather than their possessions, about the importance of maintaining your values even when nobody's watching, even when it would be easier or more profitable to compromise. The truck finally gave out 2 years ago, the transmission dying in a way that wasn't worth repairing, even for someone as attached to vehicles as I am, and I had to say goodbye to 40 years of history and memory embedded in rusted metal and cracked upholstery. Kevin offered to give me one of the dealership's luxury vehicles, said I'd earned it, said it was ridiculous for the owner of a luxury auto dealership to drive anything less than the finest car on the lot. But I declined. Bought another used Ford pickup. This one only 15 years old, but similar enough to the original that it felt familiar, like coming home after a long trip away. Kevin didn't mock this truck, didn't make jokes or comments or suggestions that I should drive something more impressive, just accepted my choice as part of who I am, part of the values that made me successful in ways he was still learning to appreciate. He told his children about their grandfather's trucks, about the lesson he'd learned from mocking the first one, about how assumptions and judgments based on appearances are almost always wrong, almost always reveal more about the person making the judgment than the person being judged. I'm 78 now, approaching the end of my story, whether I want to admit it or not, and I spend a lot of time thinking about legacy, about what I'll leave behind when I'm buried next to Linda in that cemetery, where the wind still cuts through your coat in February. The dealership will continue, probably under Kevin's leadership eventually, since he's proven himself capable and committed to maintaining the values that made it successful. The money will go to various causes and family members according to a will I've carefully structured to balance fairness with incentives for continued character growth. But the real legacy isn't the business or the money, it's the lessons, the stories, the example of a life lived with integrity and patience, and the understanding that success whispers while insecurity shouts. Kevin and I are close now, closer than we've been since he was a child, and that reconciliation is worth more to me than any amount of money or professional achievement. He visits regularly, brings his kids to learn woodworking in my shop, calls just to talk about business challenges or family concerns or random thoughts that don't fit into neat categories. Jennifer has become a friend rather than just a daughter-in-law, seeking my advice on career decisions and parenting strategies, and how to maintain authenticity in a world that rewards image over substance. Sarah remains my rock, the child who never needed dramatic lessons because she paid attention to the subtle ones, who saw through my humble exterior to the values and wisdom underneath. The management team at Morrison's gave me a surprise party last year for my 45th anniversary of ownership. 45 years since Harold Morrison first offered me that partnership that seemed impossible for a 30-year-old mechanic with no business degree and no connections. They presented me with a plaque, made speeches about my contributions and leadership, thanked me for creating a workplace culture where people are valued and respected regardless of their position. Kevin gave a speech at that party, talking about the parking lot incident, about finding out I owned the dealership, about the painful but necessary education that followed, and he thanked me publicly for loving him enough to teach him hard lessons, for respecting him enough to let him fail and learn rather than just enabling his worst impulses. I cried during that speech, couldn't help it, because hearing your son acknowledge growth and express gratitude for difficult parenting is one of the great gifts of old age, proof that the work you did actually mattered, that the values you tried to instill actually took root even if it took longer than you hoped. Linda would have loved that moment, would have been so proud of Kevin's transformation and Sarah's steady excellence and the grandchildren being raised with character and compassion, and I felt her presence in that room full of people celebrating a life and career I'd almost kept hidden forever. Looking back now, I don't regret the secrecy, don't wish I'd revealed my ownership earlier or in different circumstances, because the way it happened taught lessons that needed teaching in ways they needed to be taught. Kevin's mockery of my truck revealed assumptions and disrespect that would have continued festering, if not confronted dramatically, and my revelation of the dealership ownership provided context and motivation for him to reassess his entire approach to life and relationships. Would a gentler approach have worked? Maybe, maybe not. But this is the approach we got, and it produced genuine change, genuine growth, genuine reconciliation that feels earned rather than just